In our last video on the American Revolution, we saw how Benjamin Franklin was basically offered a deal by a mysterious, unknown person, presumably with connections in the British government, saying that Franklin would be given various rewards if he surrendered to the British and helped them to bring the new United States of America back into submission to Great Britain. We saw that Franklin was able to reject this offer because he believed the Americans could actually defeat the British and that they would flourish as an independent nation without any need to compromise their freedom. This was because most Americans were farmers who could not only supply all of the country's needs without relying on any foreign powers, but who could also fight off any invaders. This vision of agrarian self-defense without wars of expansion, with its national self-sufficiency as well as its bounty, meant that other European countries, like France, would come to America's aid, since they could be confident both of America's success and of the riches of trade in surplus commodities, all of which were thanks to the land and those who worked it. America's success rested in the hands of self-sufficient warrior farmers, the sword and the trowel. This is an intuition that Franklin had developed long before the first shots of the Revolution were fired. Ever since the repeal of the Stamp Act, Franklin had come to put less stock in foreign commerce, which at the time was a backbone of the British Empire, and he put more and more stock in agriculture, farming, and homemade manufacturing. This was the case with many Americans, and indeed it seemed the British Parliament itself was doing everything it could to force the colonies into this economic isolationism. Even as Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, it imposed greater duties on imports like tea, glass, and paint, things that the colonists could only buy from Britain. And, in addition, Parliament issued a declaratory act which reaffirmed its authority to pass any legislation on the colonies that it saw fit, which, in the eyes of the colonists, violated the rights of their governing assemblies. For some reason, people keep sending around this idea that the American Revolution was all about taxes, when really it was about broader, more fundamental violations. The colonists claimed that Parliament was making their own elected colonial governments obsolete. Kind of like if nowadays Congress said to Texas, you don't get to have a governor or lawmakers anymore. The federal Congress is just going to make all of your laws now. And we're going to send federal law enforcement to enforce everything, and you don't get a say. Leading up to 1776, the colonists thought that Parliament was changing the rules in kind of the same way, so that they could win the game and get what they want. So it's no wonder that relations between Great Britain and her American colonies continued to be strained, and that there was a growing sense of animosity between the two. By 1768, just 2 years after the repeal of the Stamp Act, Franklin was already, in his own words, at a point of despair. The events which led up to the first shots of the war in 1775 and the Declaration of Independence in 1776 are fully chronicled elsewhere, and they can be easily found. But one of the things that history books often fail to capture is a kind of metaphysical perspective surrounding the causality of those events. One might say a supernatural perspective, which can be found in the eyes even of American Enlightenment skeptics like Franklin, who seemed to see a deeper machinery behind the rise and fall of empires. Franklin wrote that the trajectory of these two nations was so stubborn, so blind, so unarrestable, that their fates seemed determined by something other than human will. He wanted to see the dispute between Great Britain and the colonies amicably and equitably settled, but he said ultimately, Providence will bring about its own ends by its own means, and if it intends the downfall of a nation, that nation will be so blinded by its pride and other passions as not to see its danger, or how its fall may be prevented. Franklin, who previously had so magnificently secured a political victory in Parliament with words, now felt completely powerless. Despite writing letters and articles, again and again, trying to ease the tension between the two continents, trying to reconcile them, to make them understand one another. Nothing changed. Franklin was tired of writing, and people were tired of reading about it. And whether or not the British public were truly blinded by Providence, they were certainly blinded by the British media of the time. British newspapers caricatured the Americans, accusing them of things they were not guilty of. To one member of Parliament named David Hartley, Franklin wrote, "You despise us too much, and you are insensible of the Italian adage that there is no little enemy. I am persuaded the body of the British people are our friends, but they are changeable, and by your lying gazettes may soon be made our enemies. Our respect for them will proportionally diminish, and I see clearly we are on the high road to mutual enmity, hatred, and detestation. A separation will, of course, be inevitable. 'Tis a million of pities so fair a plan as we have hitherto been engaged in, for increasing strength and empire with public felicity, should be destroyed by the mangling hands of a few blundering ministers. And it will not be destroyed. God will protect and prosper it. You will only exclude yourselves from any share in it. We hear that more ships and troops are coming out, and we know you may do us a great deal of mischief, but we are determined to bear it patiently as long as we can. But if you flatter yourselves with beating us into submission, you know neither the people nor the country." So even before there was a formal Declaration of Independence, Franklin was talking big about an American empire that would flourish without the British, carrying on the legacy that they began, but without them. And this may certainly seem to contradict the letter that Franklin had given to the French about America not having any ambitions for expansion, but these letters are some years apart and Franklin may have changed his mind. Whether Franklin still saw a vision of expansion, or whether he simply saw America as the body of an empire that would go on peacefully living once the arm of the British Isles had been severed, it's difficult to say. To call Franklin two-faced would be to vastly underestimate just how many faces Franklin had. But in this case, I think it might be fair to say that Franklin simply had reason to be caustic toward Great Britain at this point in his life. 6 weeks after the famous Boston Tea Party, Franklin had again been put on the spot in England, where he was questioned in the Privy Council, but with a less favorable outcome than his previous testimony before Parliament. After being berated, he was stripped of his office as deputy postmaster. Historian Andrea Wolfe writes, "The British government had stripped him of the post that he had held for almost 20 years, severing their connection with Franklin. In the briefest of letters, Franklin then advised his son William, who was the royal governor of New Jersey, to give up his position in order to become a farmer. I wish you were settled in your farm. 'Tis an honester and a more honorable, because a more independent, employment." It's shocking today to think of telling a governor to give up his post to settle in a farm. Yet for Benjamin Franklin, this was precisely the means of becoming more independent as a private individual. And thus, Andrea Wolfe continues, it was a turning point for Franklin. Farmers, he now believed, held the key to America's future because they, not the henchmen of the British Empire, would create a new nation. But of course, the success of American independence was by no means certain. There were certain conditions of success. If Americans met those conditions, then they would succeed and be free. If not, they would fail and lose everything, literally. One such condition which does bear mentioning was unity. As Franklin famously quipped at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, we must all hang together, or, most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. It was during the French and Indian War, some 2 decades earlier, that Franklin witnessed firsthand the success of an enemy under unified leadership versus 13 colonies that seemed impotent because they could scarcely cooperate, leading Franklin to create his famous symbol of a divided snake with the caption, "Join or die." Cooperation was survival, and the independence of farming was not the individualism of the loner. But if they cooperated, victory and a new nation would, at the hands of these farmers, grow from the earth itself, founded on fertile soil, rising as if from an antediluvian garden, under a younger sun. America would rise, Franklin wrote to an old friend in Britain in September of 1775, because it will, by its fertility, enable us to defend it. Agriculture is the great source of wealth and plenty. By cutting our trade, you have thrown us to the earth, whence, like Antaeus, we shall rise yearly with fresh strength and vigor. According to Greek myth, Antaeus was a giant from Libya who compelled all strangers who were passing through the country to wrestle with him. Whenever Antaeus touched the earth, his mother, his strength was renewed, so that even if thrown to the ground, he was invincible. Heracles, in combat with him, discovered the source of his strength and, lifting him up from the earth, crushed him to death. The earth would be America's strength and the source of her invincible liberty. As long as people were in touch with the earth, working it and serving it like lordly stewards of a garden, their liberty would be inviolable. Of course, while it may sound inspiring to think of nature as a source of strength and even invincibility for those who are connected with her, a kind of Sherwood Forest for lovers of freedom, the less romantic reality of the American Revolution was that, rather than being hulked out with invincible super strength from agriculture like Popeye eating his spinach, farming and gardening was more like a lifeline that kept the colonists and their armies hanging on by a thin thread of survival. The earth may not have made the Americans invincible, but it kept them alive. New England farmers provided cattle, hogs, sheep, fruits, and vegetables. Farmers in the mid-Atlantic states provided flour, bread, and beef. Sheep were raised not for food, but for wool. The wool fiber was mixed with flax fiber to produce a durable cloth called linsey woolsey, which was used to make military uniforms. Hemp became a major crop, particularly in Virginia, providing fiber for making ropes, sacks, and sailcloth. Now, this is not to say that the farmers were all angels, simply because they kept the war effort alive. Many of the farmers who lived far from the coasts and were essentially untouched by the military actions of the war became rich, selling to anyone, American, British, or French, anyone who would pay, preferably with hard money rather than fiat notes. City dwellers accused farmers of price gouging, and farmers accused merchants of the same. Nevertheless, this still remains an example of how a relationship with the land empowered private individuals with leverage, even if it wasn't always used nobly. Franklin was right about the fertility of the land and its power for the individual. When it came to the country as a whole, it wouldn't be the lack of resources that would cause the problems per se, but rather it would be economics and commerce, kinks in logistics, which proved to be the weak spot in the American struggle, and which created a problem for George Washington's Continental Army, often leaving it cold and starving. Indeed, it's a wonder that George Washington waited till the war was nearly at an end to order his troops to take up the practice of gardening. No doubt we can probably blame the fast-paced action and reaction of spring to autumn campaigns for preventing the American troops from gardening before. But either way, when the spring of 1783 rolled around, British forces had generally been vanquished in North America, and prospects of peace were on the horizon, and being left with a long time to wait for a finalized peace treaty from Paris, Washington hoped gardening would not only supply the army's needs, but that it would be a healthy and therapeutic practice for his battered men. Much of the country was in tatters, but even as the fires had been raging back in 1780, when the outcome of the war was still not completely certain, Franklin, for one, was convinced of a positive future. He had written to George Washington that after the war, he believed the country would flourish rapidly, like a field of young Indian corn which long, fair weather and sunshine had enfeebled and discolored, and which, in that weak state, by a thunder gust of violent wind, hail, and rain, seemed to be threatened with absolute destruction, yet, the storm being past, it recovers fresh verdure, shoots up with double vigor, and delights the eye not of its owner only, but of every observing traveler. Though it had smoldered with the ravages of war, like a forest decimated by wildfire, America would grow again and become beautiful and prosperous. And of course, Franklin's predictions proved true. Obviously, there were many, many factors in the success of America both before and after its revolution, but it would be agriculture, which had been an integral backbone of the war, which would go to be the backbone of the new nation and the guarantee of the private citizen's liberty. At least, that's what many believed. As we will see, new wars were about to break out in America, debates between agriculture and manufacturing, slavery and abolition, between the freedom of nature and the land and the power of commerce and manufacturing, and whether agriculture could mean freedom for everyone, regardless of their race. For now, suffice it to say that there is power, too, in agriculture. Farming wins wars, even in this modern age, during World War II, for example. A war which, flowing on the tides of the Industrial Revolution and large-scale manufacturing, was fought with modern technology. Even in this war, such nations as Germany were forced to eat what was called sawdust bread, due to a lack of flour, or so I'm told. Certainly such countries as Great Britain began farming, and even so, still lacked the land for agriculture sufficient for their needs during the war. But not so with America, which, with its agricultural power and its victory gardening efforts, was able to supply its allies with surplus food in addition to other supplies, which kept them afloat. Those who are most in tune with the earth, serving it and tending it well, as virtuous overseers, giving to it and receiving from it, they have power. We should hope that it is the lovers of the good and of liberty who remember that power.